My name is Michael Mikowski. I'm the UI architect for a company called SnapLogic, as my shirt might hint to you. And this is Josh Powell, that's with 2 L's. Josh and I have written a book called Single Page Web Applications, JavaScript End-to-End. We both gave a presentation yesterday, but it appears to have been a popular presentation given the fact that we were about 1.5 times our room capacity, both of us. And also Michael Jackson canceled today, which came as a shock to not too many people apparently. I probably could have told you that 6 months ago. But so we were asked to present here in a larger room, and so what we've done is we've blended things together. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to, or welcome to an evening at the Improv as we meld our 2 presentations together and try to bring the best of both. All right? We're going to try to give you both a little bit of a higher overview of what an SPA really is and what its pros and cons are, and we're also going to try to do a deeper dive in some of the harder stuff that I wasn't able to get to yesterday in the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to break into reading off my slides. All right? So, yeah. All right, so slide number 1, we're talking about key JavaScript techniques for successful large-scale applications. I gave a nice little speech about growing up, and I'm not going to bore people who happened to be at my presentation yesterday again, but the crux, the punchline was, when you're younger, you can do stuff and get away with it. When you're older and more mature and a more complex individual, certain rules about society that previously didn't apply to you now apply. And such is the case with JavaScript. If you're doing flashing purple monkeys on the page, who cares if you're using a global variable? However, if you're doing an inventory satisfaction system and your front end is running with 100,000 lines of JavaScript, you're probably going to need to use a little more discipline and convention to be able to work on such a large project with multiple developers. Okay, so we're going to talk about my favorite subject for a moment. That'd be me. As mentioned, I'm a co-author of the single-page web applications from end to end. This is currently in MEEP. I'm not going to give you the hard sell. You into it, buy it. Okay, please? Daddy needs a new car. All right. And I've already mentioned that I'm an architect at SnapLogic. A lot of fun there, by the way. I'm really excited about our next generation product, which I can't show you. This is actually my 5th single-page application, large-scale commercial single-page application. And I was the architect on 4 out of the 5. I was the primary developer on the 5th. The only problem there is the guy who was the primary architect on that was brighter than I was, so he got the job. As much as that pains me to say it, he was a brilliant guy. Still is, actually. Prior to stumbling into single-page application development, I was actually a back-end guy. I had a couple hundred servers that I was responsible for an advertising platform on a couple different continents, and we did about 2 billion requests per day, web transactions. As you might have guessed, it was online advertising. And just one day, had a task that nobody else seemed to be able to do, and it ended up being a single-page web application, and I've been doing them ever since. Also a great experience coming from that environment into single-page web applications, because in that environment where we used mod Perl 2, Perl, if anybody's ever worked in Perl here, you know that the structure of your program comes from convention, not from the code itself. JavaScript's very similar to that. And we'll talk about my first SPA. In fact, I'll show you an example of it in a little bit. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Josh, and he's going to talk about his favorite subject.
Yeah, I'm co-author on the book. My blog is on jsjoshing.com. I've been doing web development for 13 years, and I love Sass and I hate CoffeeScript. All right.
Way to hit the points, Josh. All right. So let's talk about the parts we're going to cover today. First of all, we're going to look at some example single-page web applications. Second of all, Josh is going to take over, and he is going to talk about the pros and cons of single-page web applications and kind of what makes one on a philosophical, higher plane way. And then we're going to look at some key JavaScript concepts that we found both in working together and then over the years that are really necessary to know to be successful with a large-scale application. The fourth part is where you try to ask questions and we run out of the room as fast as possible. Okay, that's the evasive actions. That being said, let's talk about some example single-page applications. I'm going to show you today the first one that I wrote back in 2007, which was for AMD's Where to Buy site. And by AMD, I mean the people that make chips, and like the Sledgehammer, AMD 64, those guys. The second one we'll show you is one that I worked with where I was not the architect, actually, but primary developer for Game Crush, which is quite a nice commercial site with a little bit of the not quite NSFW edge to it. And then we're going to also go over an exercise that we have in the book. So I'm going to go over these relatively quickly because we want to get to some of the meat that Josh referred to earlier. All right. So the first one we're going to look at is the AMD Where to Buy site. This was actually run off of two old AMD 64 servers that we dug out of the back room. It was actually run in a total of 8 different countries eventually, and we handled in each one of these tabs here, in some cases on the order of 1,500 products at its peak. So what I've done was dug up one of the pages and just shows you, or I'm just going to show you what what magic we had wrought back in late 2006, early 2007. This was actually pretty unheard of at the time. Anybody here use Newegg besides me? There we go. There we go. All right. So I've got stock in Newegg. No, I'm kidding. But I do, and one of my favorite features of it is Power Search, where you can go in and pick all the attributes you want of this product. You specify it down to like the screen size and everything, and then you press go, and it comes back and says no results found after chugging away for 20 seconds, right? And then you get to do that 5 or 6 different times, finding no results, until that 7th time, and now that you've spent 5-10 minutes doing this, the 7th time you do it, you come back with 500 results, all right? So not exactly the world's best UX. One thing that I was really proud of with this was that you could actually click about 10 times in the amount of time that the previous site took for one round trip. We downloaded the entire database gzipped. This was before Douglas Crockford came up with the name JSON, I believe, in 2007. Or I'm sorry, he invented it. I was just passing native JavaScript data structures in. And the actual database for our largest product group of 1,500 came in at about 250 kilobytes compressed and gzipped. So pretty impressive, and the people that ordered this at AMD were really happy with that. So it was good. It's kind of nice to go back into the Wayback Machine. All right, so I'm going to go now to the a little bit more risque site, which is the Game Crush. And I just want to show you a little bit of evolution here. So let's go and look at Mave, one of my favorites apparently. This is kind of a cross between a gaming site and a dating site. What I'm going to do here is just pull up a couple of the images that Mave has on site. And what I want you to take a look at is notice that on the right-hand side I've got comments that are being loaded, and on the left-hand side I have Mave. I'm focusing on Mave right now. But the thing that you'll notice is that as I move forward on these pictures here, the only thing that updates, even though I have multiple layers on the screen here, is the image of Maeve. The only thing that changes is what needs to change. There's no time wasted on re-rendering the entire page. Now imagine that you're looking at this in a Web 2.0 page, right? It would re-render everything. This, by the way, folks, is becoming fast unacceptable, right? Not what I'm showing you, the other way, right? I mean, I'm losing all patience with sites now where when I go from one page to the next, I've got to wait 15 seconds for all the ads to re-render, right? Compare that again to here where you click a forward button or a backward button and it instantaneously responds and only the parts that need to change. Now check this out. I'm going to hit the back button a couple of times and we can see exactly where I came from. Or I can hit the forward button. Now somebody asked me yesterday, how do you do that? My answer was by the book. It's a little bit complicated and we really don't have time to go over that, but I'm actually quite proud of that and there's a very overriding technique that you can employ that will always work for history support. All right, now the last one we're going to take a look at today is an actual example. And this is running Node.js in the background. I'm going to just restart Node right now. Okay, so what you'll see here is an example of chat. Now, of course, chat isn't just limited to instant messaging, but it's probably the most accessible example of it. So let's load up Alfred, or Alfred as the case may be. Now notice that Alfred's online all by himself. We're now going to join in with, let's see, Barry. Barry's named oddly. But notice that Barry instantly shows up on the user list here. Of course, we've all seen Socket.io examples, so we're not going to worry about too much detail. And now I'm going to sign in again here. And, what's a good name? Anyone? What's that? Maeve? Oh, yeah. I know what your mind is at, sir. Okay. How do we spell Maeve here? M-A-E-V-E. There's a Maeve in the audience, apparently. There we go, Maeve. Although she's not here in person, she's here in spirit. Thank you, Maeve. Okay, notice when I added that on the other two windows that those immediately responded. And you'll also notice that as Maeve here, that before I logged in, I wasn't able to actually open the chat windows, but now I am able to open the chat windows. Also, you'll notice that there is no refreshing of the page. In a Web 2.0 thing, if I was going to put this profound message and share it with others, and then press the return button or click on send here, what would happen is that it would, of course, reload the entire page. But in this case, of course, only the changes that are coming across, in this case, over a socket connection. I want to say one more thing about socket connections. Expect a lot of communication that you currently do over HTTP and AJAX to go over socket connections, at least the lightweight messages. Think about a chess game, right? When you move a piece, the other client only needs to know that you moved the piece. It doesn't need 1,200 bytes of header information to go via an AJAX through a server, right? It only needs the 8-byte header associated with the web connection, or the socket connection, and then the few bytes that indicate what your move was. So you can get your chess piece moved down to probably about 16 bytes versus 1,216 bytes that you'd use with an AJAX call. And that's quite compelling. All right, so those are some example SPAs. Now, Josh is going to talk to you about the philosophy of what an SPA really is, and I think he does a bang-up job, so let's give a hand for the Josh man, all right?
All right. Well, what is an SPA? What is a single page application? All right, thanks. Well, it's simply a website where the page does not reload. So if you look at the traditional web application, how it works today, the person will come in, make a request to the server, Amazon.com, and you'll get Amazon will do whatever processing you need to on the server, and it'll return an HTML page to the client, which will have a list of CSS, JavaScript, and images that need to get loaded. They may be cached, they may not be. If they're not, it makes a whole bunch more requests back to the server, which then responds with them. And, ooh, something happened. All right, quickly go back there. And then, finally, the page gets loaded. But then when you click on any links or try to navigate, do anything, purchase something, you have to do the whole round trip all over again. And then you have to do it again on the next one. So the big difference with SPAs isn't the first load. The first load is pretty much the same, except that the HTML gets rendered on the client side. But then after that, all you do is make a request for the data to the server. The server doesn't have to spend all of its time processing HTML strings out of that data. It just quickly gets to the data and returns it back to the client. And then the client takes it and does whatever it needs to do with it, just changing the parts of the page that need to change. So what are the benefits of a single page application? The first benefit is it doesn't feel like a flat page. Things move around and are interactive. Even today when you go out and are surfing around the web, it feels very much, when you go from page to page, like you're turning the page in a magazine or newspaper. You're just refreshing everything. Instead, you get a more interactive page that can draw the users in and makes for a much better user experience. The page also loads a lot quickly because so much less is being loaded with each request. So traditional web versus single page web application. They're reloaded. All right. Another important point is a single page application distributes the load off of your servers. You've got these tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars worth of servers sitting around processing strings into HTML and sending it over across the wire. Well, why not distribute that string processing out to all the clients and let the clients do that? It results in a much cheaper and much more quickly scalable system. Another huge benefit of single-page applications, especially the kind we've outlined in the book, is that you can use one language end-to-end. In your traditional application, on the client side, you've got JavaScript. On the server side, you've got Ruby, Groovy, Python, Java, Lisp, Perl, ASP, or something else. And then when working with the database, you have to work with SQL. So, and then you've got all the libraries and plugins and things associated with each language. You have different ways of thinking associated with each stack. They're object-oriented, static, strongly typed variables on the server, and your SQL on the back end. They're very different mindsets to be thinking in. And then on the client side, you've got a dynamic, loosely typed language. So you've got all these different skills you have to master, and you end up quite often having to have different people at different levels of the system because there's just so much to learn. Or you have to get somebody who's really skilled, who's been around for a long time, who can program in the entire stack. In a single page application with JavaScript end-to-end, JavaScript on the client, JavaScript on the server, JavaScript in the database. So you don't have to switch contexts, you don't have to think in one and then think in another way. You just do the same, you think the same sort of processes all along. You use similar libraries and plugins between the different systems. You can use the same IDE to work across them. It's just a much cleaner, smoother environment to work in. So how do we get JavaScript end-to-end in the stack? We're using jQuery on the client side, Node.js on the server, and MongoDB for the database. For the client side, there are, of course, a whole host of other frameworks and languages and things you could use. But in fact, as long as you're following a standard pattern framework, that you don't actually need all these all these other libraries. You can do it just using jQuery. Well, you could use it just using JavaScript, but I wouldn't recommend that. Another benefit for single-page applications is you've got one data format. The same way you have different mindsets when working with different languages, it's the same thing. Take a traditional Ruby on Rails application. In the front end, you're dealing with JSON format, active record on the server side, and SQL results from the database. So you spend a lot of your time marshaling data from one data structure to another. Imagine you have to take the JSON, transform it into active record, transform it into a SQL to query the database, take the results, transform them back to active record, and then print out JSON with them, send them back over to the client. That's a lot of marshaling and work involved in working with the stack. Now we have stuff that abstracts this away from us because it's so much of a pain to work in, but it's much better if you can just use one format from end to end where you don't have to do all this marshaling from data. You don't have to have the abstractions. You can just take the data right out of the database, pass it to the server, which speaks it natively, and then pass it back into the UI, which is the way it's used. So it's much better to be able to store the data in the exact format you're going to be using it in. So benefits of an SPA. You get dynamic and interactive sites, no more flat two-dimensional pages. It loads quickly because you only update the parts of the page that need to be updated. You distribute server load onto the client machines, making it a cheaper and more scalable solution. You get one language end-to-end, JavaScript, and one data format end-to-end, JSON. But everything's not bright and shiny with SPAs. There are some pitfalls. So some of the pitfalls are that you can easily break the back button so that when a section of the page you expected to be able to revisit, when you press back, you could break out and go to the last site you were on. I think we've all ran into that in Flash sites where you can only link to the front page of the application, and then if you go in and dig around, you can't send links out to that. Mike demonstrated how that worked. You must make it Googleable because Google spiders don't execute JavaScript. You're moving lots of code to the client, and things can get messy because you suddenly have 100,000 lines of code in JavaScript, which was initially intended as a scripting language. Analytics require work because you just can't take Google Analytics and paste a snippet on every page and call it done. And there's no sense of what errors are happening on connected clients. Because when you're using a traditional web application, you've got your server log, which takes all the errors that are happening and just dumps them out to the log. Whereas now, your clients are off using the site, and you have no idea what errors they're encountering. So the bright side is that all these pitfalls are solvable. And they're all solvable, and we go over them all in the book on how to solve them. If you're at my presentation on yesterday, then I went through the list of how it works. But we'll go over some of them at the end today if there's time.
We got asked to do this last night about 6 o'clock in the evening, I think maybe 6:30. So, excuse the improv aspect of this. All right, so powering things back up, we're going to talk about solving some of those problems we talked about earlier. I do want to bring Mav back up because she seems to have a fan set here. One thing I do want to show, actually, that's interesting about this is that, as you notice when I clicked one button here, the only thing that changed was the image and the comments. Now, what happens if I take this URL, copy it, paste it into a new tab like this? Any guess on what's going to happen? Pretty cool, huh? The error message is about the XMPP chat, which wouldn't happen if we were using, but the bottom line is the entire state is held there, even though now when I move here, I'm again only changing what's changed. So there's a way of delegating things that allow you to do that. Okay, so back to that presentation we had running. Oh, here we go. The presentation is running. There we go. So, if you don't like single-page applications, there are other options, so I thought I'd bring those up here for you. Here's one you can always pick if you'd like. Another one's real popular these days, Mobile Flex, and of course, what we're talking about today. So, let's review a few points that we've brought up already, but this is building to something bigger. As we mentioned, with a single-page web application, most of the application moves to the client. Your backend is basically your document store and your authentication and user database. Pretty much everything else moves to the front end. That means you got to code at a much larger scale than you used to on the front end. If you hit 100,000 lines in JavaScript, you're not alone. There's a lot of sites nowadays that are hitting that amount or even greater. And also, since most of your application is moving to the front end, instead of having one front end developer or maybe two and 8 back end developers, you're having 1 or 2 back end developers and 8 front end developers. That means that all the convention and discipline that you previously used on the back end now actually becomes important on the front end. And actually, you can be a little more loosey-goosey on the server side now because, 1 or 2 people can maintain it. So what we're going to talk about now are the key concepts that we found that you really need to understand to make a successful large-scale single-page application. All right, and we've got about 20 minutes to do it. So, first of all, we're going to talk about architecture. Then we're going to talk about data types and names, Scopechains, hoisting, prototype-based objects as opposed to class-based, some forms of closures, and execution context. By the way, if you want to fall asleep, do so now, because I'm going to wake your ass up when execution context comes around. Because I respect you as an individual, and I think you need to understand this, okay? Execution context is one of those hard things that when you buy a JavaScript book, they always jump over. They're like, really we should cover this because it's kind of fundamental to how JavaScript works, but gosh, it's kind of hard to explain, so we'll skip over it. All right? I've given this presentation to people who've coded in JavaScript for 2 years and went, execution object what? Right? It's amazing how many people are coding in JavaScript and don't understand that. And it's really important that you do. If you don't, go back to sleep. And we'll talk about the module pattern, which kind of pulls everything together. First of all, architecture. This is taped on the wall by my desk and on my coworker's desk and at the vice president's desk as well. If you're not careful on a large-scale SPA and you all just start coding on features and stuff, you're going to find spaghetti really fast and various other Italian foods. What happens here with this architecture, and this is in the book and detailed, you see where all those red arrows just kind of descended from the heavens? There's boilerplate for all of those. Not only that, this has API calls going in one direction and data flow going in the other. And so we take great pains to make sure that we have isolation between models and between feature modules. So, like, if you take a look from on the far right-hand side, you see a user there. He's not just any normal user, he's a happy user. You can tell by the expression on his face. And on the left, we basically have our data source in the web server. In between, we have various modules. There's a data layer that exists. That data layer knows nothing about any of the modules above it. In other words, we don't allow it to make any API calls to any of the modules that come after it. Whereas all modules that come after it may call it. And that sort of convention helps provide a level of isolation that allows us to have multiple developers work on multiple modules at one time because we have an API contract between our modules. I'm not going to go any further into it because I take up the rest of the hour. But certainly something you want to think about before you dive in with your team of 8. Another point that we like to do is to name our variables according to the scope that they're used in. Generally, we use underscores for variables that are local, and then if they're of a module scope, we'll use camel case. Yeah, I know, this is real trivial stuff, guys, but I'll tell you what, anything you can do to reduce the cognitive overhead you have to deal with when reading code is very useful to redirect into some sort of productive activity as opposed to wasting your time solving a riddle. Also, when you're doing a single page web application, you should be creating one global variable and that's it. All right, if you're creating more than one global variable when you're creating your single page web application, you're doing it wrong. Okay. Let's talk about variable types. Well, we all know that JavaScript is the dynamically typed or loosely typed language, and we should have no concern about data types. It's funny that I should mention that, though, because apparently the people who just released TypeScript feel that type is kind of important. Also, the people who recently released the Clojure compiler, or actually quite a while ago, actually have a way of indicating type in comments in the Clojure compiler. GWT exists arguably largely because people who are using it prefer to have a strongly typed language versus the loose or dynamically typed JavaScript. And finally, Dart also provides a way of indicating type in JavaScript. So if you don't think type's important in JavaScript, you go ahead and continue to feel that way, although I encourage you to go and add a subscript 1.5 to an array and see what happens. It's interesting. The bottom line is most variables you'll ever create in JavaScript never change type. And oftentimes those that do are by mistake. Also, another thought to keep in mind is polymorphic interfaces are a really cool CS trick, but they're rarely a good idea in practice. Now, I say rarely. There are cases where they make a lot of sense. But let me give you a for instance. If you're writing a function that returns a string, return a string, always. Don't return null for a special value and return false in a different case or true in a different case. I mean, that's really clever, folks. But if you're going to indicate an exceptional situation, throw an exception. That's why God invented exceptions.
I think that was wrong.
All right. So what we do on large projects is we name our variables to indicate type. And if you don't know the type or the type changes, we call it data. Now, you don't have to follow this. You can make up your own notation. At one point, I used a Hungarian notation, which the Hungarians love, but English speakers don't. This is less precise, but it reads a lot better in English. And I highly encourage you to indicate the type in your names. Or, of course, you can always go back and use Clojure compiler or Dart or TypeScript or whatever. But I found in large projects, this really reduces cognitive overhead. It also indicates intent. So if you end up with a file with a name that indicates it's supposed to be a string and you find a Boolean, you know, whoa, somebody screwed up somewhere. Okay, let's talk about variable scope a little bit. Scope in JavaScript, as most of us probably already know, is functional. In other words, if you want to scope something, put it in a function. In this example here, you're seeing this freeman text, which is declared at the top level or global scope. and when we log it, its value is presented. However, this prisoner text does not escape outside of this function, and therefore when you try to log it down here, it shows up as not declared. You'll actually get an error. Now, one problem with JavaScript, which by the way is solved by the use of the word, the use strict pragma, but we won't get into that. But it's very easy to create global variables unintentionally. And here we illustrate that, where I'm using a variable I within a function, I forget to declare it, and therefore it becomes a global, whereas in the second example, that does not happen. You need to recognize in JavaScript, even though you can declare and assign things at one time, inside of JavaScript, it's actually two different steps. Declaration always happens at the top of a function, and assignment happens at runtime as necessary. We recommend that you use a single var statement per functional scope. There's no need to have multiple var statements. There's no performance advantage to it at all. All your variables that you declare within a functional scope will be declared by JavaScript immediately on invocation of that function. So if you think, hey, I'm going to hold off on declaring these 25 variables to the bottom to save time, you're not. We recommend that you place one assignment per line, although you may use multiple declarations per line. And we always prefer to declare first and assign later, because that mimics the JavaScript actual implementation. JavaScript first declares and then assigns. And as I mentioned before, and we'll talk about a little bit further, combining the two can actually cause confusion. We will illustrate that. All right, let me talk about scope chains. This example here I'm going to zip through really quick. Notice that we have this variable called freeman text. That is set at the top level here in the window context. So I've indicated the context next to each one of these logs or assignments. And you'll see that we're always using the window context or global context. So it's always coming out with the same value. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky, and you got to remember about scope chains. See in the first declaration here, I've declared freeman text in the window scope. In the second declaration, which is in this visit supermax function, I guess I have a pointer, I might as well use that here, huh? This is assigned in the window visit supermax scope, okay? So notice the scope starts piling up as I start going deeper into functions. Now, here I've declared the same name variable in a window.visitSupermax.visitPrison scope. Okay? So when I log it here, that's where scope chain comes into play. JavaScript says, hey, within my current scope, do I have a variable named freeman text? In this case, it does. And it's only declared. Since it's only declared, it gets the default value of undefined. So when you log this, you will see undefined here. Down a little later here, where my cursor is, we have this, it's also logging it, but it's logging it within the window.visitSupermax scope. Again, JavaScript looks in that scope and says, do I have a variable with that name within the scope chain? And the truth is, you do, it's up here. So it then provides that value. In this case, it's going to log assigned. And then finally at the end here, when we call the log, we're back in the global scope, and so it finds the value in that global scope chain. So we don't have local versus global, we have local versus more local versus more local, right? Now let's talk about hoisting. In this case, we're showing how variables are always, the declaration of variables is always hoisted to the top of functional scope. So in this example, in most languages, if you were to encounter this console log prisoner text, you would expect an error because prisoner text has not been defined yet. But in this example, and as I mentioned earlier with JavaScript, since all declarations are hoisted to the top of the function, this prisoner text variable is defined, well, it is declared, and it has a value of undefined. So in the first log, it will show up as undefined. In the second log, the declaration, which is order dependent, comes into play, and the declared variable is shown. Okay, so now let's take a look at this freeman text here, which is in the window scope. It is assigned, it's defined and assigned when the value is logged. Nothing really unusual here. Basically, I'm using a global variable within this function. That's all kosher. But look what happens here. All the same code, the only difference is that we do this declaration below this log. And if you paid attention in the last example, or you're just a smart cookie, or you knew this before you came in here, you'll know that this declaration gets hoisted to the top of the internal function, and so therefore, the declaration by default assigns undeclared to the variable, so this console log is not going to provide us with freeman text as assigned. No, it's going to give us undefined because the visit prison inner function looks in its scope chain to find freeman text. It finds the local, a local copy of that variable and uses that, okay? A lot of people get burned by this one. So bottom line, guys, put your declarations of all variables at the top of your functions and you won't be thrown for a loop. Let's see what time we got here. All right, we got a few minutes. We'll go to 3:10, right? Okay. I'm going to hop over the object construction for a little bit. And if we get some luck, we'll come back to that because we're running a little short on time here. I want to talk about that one thing I don't want you to sleep through, which is the execution object. Although, if you want to come and talk about objects, I'm certain Josh would love to speak with you about it. Okay. So let's talk about the execution context object. This is the thing that most JavaScript books or online guides seem to skip over because it's just plain too hard to explain. However, it's kind of the kernel of how JavaScript works, right? The key to remember is that when JavaScript is executed, every time you run a function, JavaScript constructs an execution context object. All right, let me rephrase that. Every time you call a function, an execution context object is created. And by creating closures over the execution context object is the whole basis of how we create objects inside of JavaScript. Oops. So let's look at an example. Now, what I'm going to show you isn't necessarily absolutely correct, but conceptually, if you think of execution this way, you're going to do good. All right? So on the left-hand side, we have some code that's running. On the right-hand side, we have this concept of an execution object, or execution context object. So on the right-hand side, we have a invocation of a function. On the right-hand side, we show the object, which is empty at this point. When it's run, the values for the execution context object of the arguments are placed in to the object. And then this is a two-pass process. On the first pass, all these local variables, I'm pointing at my screen here and I realize that you don't see my finger, so I'm going to try to use the cursor here. All the variables are assigned, I'm sorry, not assigned. All the variables are declared, not assigned. So you see that here in the execution object. And then inner functions then are recursively added to the execution object in a similar fashion. On the run of the code, on the second pass, as we go through the code and variables are assigned, the execution context then actually gets the assignment. Okay? You have anything to add here, Josh?
Yeah, let me just try and say that succinctly here. What this means is that the way variable hoisting works is you quite often don't hear it described. You say what the result of it is that the variables get hoisted to the top. And the way that hoisting works is the JavaScript engine runs over each function twice. The first time it runs over the code, it declares all the variables, then it runs over it again, and it actually assigns all the variables. So it's not magic that gets the variables hoisted to the top, it's because it runs over the code twice.
I knew I was missing something. Thanks, Josh. So let's take a look at that kind of in action with the closures here.
One more thing, Mike.
Oh, please.
The execution object is not accessible in JavaScript. It's something that happens in the background, so you can't actually get access to and log it or see it. But it's there, trust me.
Well, and actually, if you recognize that that's there, what I'm going to talk about right now is the closures and how those actually keep references to the execution context object. So in the case that we're seeing in front of us here, it's a little bit dense, but like my cousin Lenny. But you see here that we have an inner function that is returned, okay? And so when I do this log message and I create this function and provide this argument called yeah, I am assigning back to log message effectively pointers that point to the execution object. So from that point forward, whenever I run this log message function, it's always going to log yeah. I can call curry log message a number of additional times with different values, but my original function that was returned is always going to have the closure over the that yeah word there. Sorry about this. In the second example, I'm calling this without assigning the function to anything. I'm just providing a string, and then I'm providing an execution set of parentheses. And so what happens is that what will be logged is Bob Newhart rules, for all those fans out in the audience. But there is no variable that captures the return, and therefore there is no closure. The execution context reference count goes to 0, and it can be garbage collected. We'll look at that again, using our curry log function. We have a function called log, we're creating a function called log hello. And then notice I do a copy of that called log copy. And then I have a staying alive function, again using the curry log message. So you can see if I run log hello, I'll get hello. If I run the copy of it, I'll see hello again. Down below here, I'm deleting these functions. I delete the log copy, and I delete one reference to the execution context object, but there's still one remaining. It's only when I delete the second and final remaining reference to that execution context that it becomes available to delete. This is kind of a contrived example, but you actually see this in real life. You need to be real careful about cleaning up all your references to objects, or you will get memory leaks. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and use IE6 for a little while and do some JavaScript attributes on a DOM object. So a couple deep thoughts about closures. It's very easy to create deep closures. This is one reason why, as a general rule, you should try to avoid nesting functions as much as possible. If you think about it, a lot of your nested functions you don't need to nest. Closure is very good when you want it. Think object inheritance, and it's very bad when you don't, the aforementioned memory leak. There are rules like the one I just mentioned, to help avoid unintended closures, like don't declare a function in a loop. And the final point, which I've mentioned before, is that the execution context objects are always maintained until you get that reference count to 0. So think of an execution object like a file system. And we are now over time by a whole minute. And so I think it's time to draw the presentation to a close. So,
unless you guys want us to stick around.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll stick around till the next presenter shows up. So
It's break now.
it's break time coming up here. So if you want to stick around, I'll finish the presentation. We only have a couple more slides left. All right. I want to talk about self-executing anonymous functions. We mentioned before that JavaScript does not offer block scope. And that's not actually 100% true. It's practically true. If you use JavaScript 1.7 plus for Mozilla, there are constructions that you can use now to actually provide block scope. But in practice, I found it not very useful. Instead, what you'll see a lot of is the concept of an anonymous or self-executing anonymous function, which, by the way, if you're doing an interview for a JavaScript position today, these days, you almost will always be asked this by everybody that you interview with. In this example, we're declaring a function like normal. However, at the end, we're putting parentheses with an optional set of arguments in that. What happens with that is that the function then executes immediately using the arguments that you provided in the parentheses at the end. Like here, I'm showing you the classical jQuery turkey sandwich implementation, where jQuery is actually what we're passing in, and then we're renaming it as $sign inside this function. And in this example, we have this variable called warning message. And notice now that I have it inside of this functional scope. So when I log it here, it says, hear me now and believe me later in the greatest Saturday Night Live tradition. Whereas down here, that same variable scope is not available. I get the global scope, and I instead see tornado. So the way that we have local private variables inside of JavaScript is to use the self-executing anonymous function. And I mentioned the turkey sandwich earlier. So now we can take that self-executing anonymous function and use what we call a module pattern. Now, back in the early portion of the presentation, you may have remembered me talking about you should only create one global variable for your entire application. This is how we do it. What we can do is we can take a variable, in this case SPA, and we can assign it to a function, as we've done here. And then what we're able to do is, through the use of the return statement, return all of our public functions. Anything that's not returned is a private function or variable. So, for those of us who love the aspect of private versus public in Java, the same is available via JavaScript, just through a little bit different syntax. And yeah, maybe a little more convoluted.
One more thing here, Mike.
Go ahead.
So one more thing here is through the magic of closures, these private variables are still available to all these public methods. So when you return this warn user and then execute it, it will still remember what these private variables are. So they're still accessible. You can create getters and setters for them if you want to. It's a very useful pattern.
Sure. Oh yeah, yeah. You can do it both ways, but the way that you've just referred to is wrong. No, they're both correct. This one though, it's just pairing the parentheses in a different way. Both of them work. And this just happens to be the one that we prefer and that we use consistently throughout the book. Okay. If you look at our book, or if you look at the way that we namespace, we actually create an object called SPA, and then we end up splitting it into various namespaces. And I'm actually going to break form here since we've got a little bit of time for the people that stayed a little bit later. I want to show it to you a little bit in the actual application. So I've got this Node applications running here. And let's take a look at public, and I'm going to increase the font size here. Let's do a tree here. And you'll see that we actually have spa.chat, spa.data, spa.model, spa.shell. If you remember anything of that architecture diagram before, you notice these match exactly the names in that architecture diagram, and not by accident. If you take a look at spa.js, you'll see here that we declare SPA first, and it has some public functions. And then if I look at spa.shell, we're just building off of that original object. What this allows us to do is break our large project into functional namespaces and define what those functions are for each namespace, which improves the ability for us to split the project up against multiple developers significantly, right? So I can say this shell is responsible for the shell of the application for the general window, and you, Bob, are the guy who's going to get to work on that. And Frank, I got this spa.chat function. It's going to have a defined API back to the shell, and you, Frank, are responsible for doing that. You guys figure out the API. And oh, by the way, the benefit of doing this is that when Frank finishes with his chat function and we want to use it on another project, it's really easy to do because it's isolated and it's got a defined API. Okay, so much for going off the beaten track here. Let's get on the beaten track. Yeah, that keeps coming up because my wireless is trying to hook up even though I have the wired connection. So, some best practice. Pick only one namespace for your app, as I mentioned before. That should be your only global variable. Subdivide, as I just mentioned. Let's say I have a division called model, which is a recommendation. I've got boilerplate for all of this, by the way. But let's say I have a portion of a model that requires some SVG handling. Well, then you can subdivide it. You can say spa.model.svg. And let's say I have a component of the model that is specific to users. I can have spa.model.users. Okay? Also, we recommend that you use parallel namespaces for CSS and your JavaScript files. So if you've got something called spa.shell.js, your CSS classes that are controlled by that module should be named spa-shell-blank. You fill in the blank, the prefix is not optional. Okay? Now, you're not required to do that, but it's a very handy convention because we're generating all of our HTML with our own modules, so why not name the classes after the modules that control them and use them? And I have to say it one more time, buy the book if you want more, because Daddy does need a new car. You haven't seen my car, it's disgusting. Okay, so in grand summary, these concepts that we're talking about, not all of them are unique, but we have found over many years that they are all important for successful large-scale single-page applications. As we mentioned, understanding types, scope chain, and hoisting help demystify the otherwise odd-seeming behavior that you deal with JavaScript, especially if you come from a different language where you expect things to work one way, and certainly in JavaScript they work another. Another thing that I think is very important to take away is the execution context object is at the heart of much of the head-scratching behavior with JavaScript. Remember that object's there. Remember when you create an object that you are creating a closure over the execution object, and things start making sense that used to make me scratch my head a number of years ago. We didn't talk about objects because we didn't have time, but prototype inheritance can be easy and useful and fast. And we will make this presentation available so you can take a look a little bit more about prototype inheritance. And again, in summary, the self-executing anonymous function pattern replaces blocks and is the basis for the module pattern. And finally, closures are all about reference counts. It's very much like a Unix file system. You know, if you've ever been a Unix administrator, you know that until that last reference to the file goes away, the file itself is actually not deleted. And that concludes, thanks for staying around, guys. That concludes the presentation on single-page web applications. And thank you all for staying longer and giving me the love I need.